Party, and Joshua Collins, the U.S. House of Representatives candidate from Washington's Congressional District Number 10. We had intended another guest, but unfortunately they were unable to make it with us, so it'll probably be a slightly shorter show than usual. We are Progressive Washington, the media outlet of the Washington Progressive Party. We have been around since 2002 in Washington, and we are associated with the Vermont Progressive Party that's been around since the 1980s. Came out of Bernie Sanders' run for Vermont, Burlington mayor in Vermont. And thank you for joining us, Tyler.
Why don't we start just by letting people introduce themselves? Maybe Akua, if you could go first and just tell us who you are and a little bit about, the subject is socialism, the word, but I really just want people to know who you are and where you're coming from.
So my name is Akua Walters. I am the National Director of Outreach at the National Progressive Party. We are essentially working to organize another major party in the United States outside of the Greens, the Democrats, and the Republicans. And we're approaching politics from a more localized standpoint. We're laser focused on winning local elections, as opposed to going up for the congressional seats.
Okay, and Joshua, you're the candidate in the room. Give us your pitch. Who are you? Where are you running?
Well, I'm a 26-year-old truck driver. I'm running for Congress in Washington's 10th district. It's one of the most crowded races in Washington's congressional races, like in recent history. And we've got 18 opponents, 19 including me. And I'm running under the ballot line of the Essential Workers Party, which that was a decision we made pretty late on in the race during this pandemic. We thought it would be a pretty good move based on the reception of working class people in the district. I support a Green New Deal. I support ending the wars, Medicare for all. I also really like the idea of a national health service similar to like the UK's system. I want to have broad policies that deal with automation and address climate change on the scale that's needed.
Cool. Welcome. So the topic is socialism, the word. The intention with having this show was really to talk about where are we going to go as a society when socialism is both this buzzword on the left of proactive change and the answer to a lot of problems, and also this demonized problem for the center where it's literally the only good reason anybody had, for example, to not elect somebody like Bernie Sanders. So Akua, I'd like to go back to you because I know you have a lot more real world experience, and I want to ask you and frame it this way. What is the relationship between socialism and progressivism, and how does that play out in your unique vantage point, based on the places you've lived and the life you've lived, the real world experience you've had?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tyler. So just to give some more context, as you can tell by my very American accent, I'm from New York, but I was born in Jamaica. Born and raised in Jamaica. Went to high school in Jamaica. Went to college in Jamaica, and then migrated to the U.S. As an adult. So I've always been politically active in politics in Jamaica. What's interesting about socialism, and I'll address socialism from the context of a Caribbean context. From a Caribbean context. So what that means is we're looking at I'd like to examine what socialism meant when Fidel Castro, Michael Manley, who was one of the founders of Jamaica, and Maurice Bishop, who was the former prime minister of Grenada, who was essentially assassinated by and this is no longer conjecture, assassinated by paramilitary force trained by the United States. We've always had because of the unique makeup of the Caribbean's geography. We've always been small nation states, which meant that we've always had to have government-run services. So we're talking about utilities. We're talking about utilities. We're talking about transportation. All of those were usually public-owned. The one example I like to give when talking about socialism and how that broke down in the Caribbean over the last couple of decades was the Jamaica Public Service, which essentially, the government of Jamaica divested from the Jamaica Public Service, and they left in place this weird law that gave the Jamaica Public Service sole power to transmit, sole authority to transmit energy throughout Jamaica. So what that meant was when the government when the public divested from the energy company, which was considered socialist at the time, because it was government run. What ended up happening was they ended up creating a monopoly, and we've seen that theme play out across the Caribbean and America, where the government used to run a lot of these programs, but as private equity got involved, we in essence created a lot of monopolies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is what's the relationship between socialism and progressivism from your point of view? And what's how much crossover is there?
So I'd say socialism and progressivism do have a bit of crossover, but here's the difference, right? When we're talking about socialism, we're talking about the government. Well, I dare say socialists don't necessarily consider themselves progressives, but there's mixes in there. But here are the main differences. If you think about socialism, you want to think about the public owning most of the infrastructure, essentially. So the main services like your social safety net, education, healthcare. Those are types of things that we tend to think about when we talk about socialism. But when we're talking about progressivism mostly goes along the lines of, let's look at ways that we can make capitalism work. And I think that is the main difference between socialism and progressivism. There is some crossover there, like social democrats tend to tread along progressive lines, but progressives essentially think that capitalism is more or less okay, while socialists tend to say, capitalism isn't necessarily the way that we want to run our government. We want most things to be owned by the public, and that is, as I understand it, that is those are some of the main sticking points between socialists and progressive.
Okay. Let's go to Joshua. Obviously a very different perspective on the issue. Just tell us, what does it look like from your angle? You're running for office. You got a brand new party here, and and you're a self-proclaimed socialist. I see this all when I watch your posts, especially on TikTok, which I love. I see you owning that. What does it look like from your angle?
So the word socialism is a very broad term. If you say you're a socialist, it doesn't necessarily describe what you believe the government's role would be in a society. I myself am a libertarian socialist. Now, what this means is that I believe in personal freedoms, but I also believe that the working class should own and control the government and the economy. Now, for a lot of governments in the past, that has meant that the government, or a lot of systems in the past, that means the government has owned most industries, and in a lot of societies, that hasn't, the authoritarian nature of that type of system hasn't been favorable and hasn't lasted throughout more than a few decades in many cases. What I believe in is a system where the most basic necessities are controlled by the government as a whole, and the government is controlled democratically by the people with no outsized influence by corporations or the very wealthy. But I also believe that other things should be directly controlled and owned by workers through things like worker co-ops and militant unions. This type of system, you can probably look more towards like something called syndicalism, where, you know, things like the trucking industry, it wouldn't make sense to have the government own the trucks, but it would make sense to have workers directly owning the semi-trucks rather than having a corporation that owns them and then capitalizes off of the labor of the workers. Now, we have one of the biggest and most complicated economies in the history of the world. And so personally, I think it makes a lot of sense that we would have different ways of having, you know, a more democratic structure and a more community based control of our economy that would be different based on, you know, from industry to industry. You know, the healthcare industry, I think most of us would agree that it doesn't make sense to have a profit, especially when it comes to things like pharmaceuticals, like our hospitals. You know, we can see the downsides of having health insurance owned by a private corporation. But then you have things like, you know, who makes the socks, like who makes t-shirts, who makes cars, like those things we can understand why we would want a different system. But I don't think that that means we have to have a capitalist system, because what capitalism means is that you have someone who owns the means of production that doesn't do the work, and they capitalize off of the labor of the workers who actually do the work. And personally, I think that is the dynamic we need to address in basically every facet of our society, which, you know, you see that from, you know, bosses owning workplaces where the workers do all the work, but also landlords owning homes while, you know, and using that to extract wealth from the labor of a renter. And that's what I think we need to address. I think that socialism is it's the bare minimum for us to address the ownership paradigm that leads to a lot of the inefficiencies and inequalities that we experience in our society.
Yeah, so it comes down, I mean, to somewhat paraphrase, I mean, I guess maybe this is my point of view, it comes down to economic justice, really. And the question is about how are we going to get there? So, I mean, how do we get there? Like, I'm asking you kind of these general questions because I see you guys as like these, you know, really powerful leaders in your own corner of the world. You know, Joshua with the young people, you know, the amount of reach you have to transmit ideas is just incredible. And likewise, you know, Akua being, you know, being able to frame these ideas and just reach a lot of people and potentially catalyze a movement. And feel free to jump in here, Courtney, as well. You know, what's next? Where do we take a concrete step to actually create this society of economic justice that we all know we need and we're all working towards, even though we use slightly different words for it?
Well, if Courtney, I'd love to go after Courtney gets a word in.
Well, I am not steeped in theory. I know how I feel. I know how to. I think one of the things in between space between getting to socialism from capitalism, I think society can make clear delineations on what we think should be included in the social safety net. Some time ago, our organization in our revolution wing of the Washington Progressive Left came up with a list: healthcare, postal service, schools, prisons, social security / UBI considerations, foster care, child care, utilities, water, internet, cell services, public lands and natural resources, banks, mass transit, airways, railways, ferries, buses, infrastructure, military and associated industries, Veterans Administration, scientific funding, space exploration, NASA, libraries, elections, legal services, first responders, and community housing. Like these, I've even rattled this list off to some Republicans, and they've been like, yeah, that's kind of a reasonable thing for, you know, private industry to not be in or have public options for. So I feel like there's a lot of space where we can come together, and these are socialist ideas, but they cross because they meet human need. And when we meet human need, we reduce crime, we reduce desperation, and we enable people to grow and be their true selves. So that's one of the thoughts that come to my mind. With my limited understanding of socialism, there's socialism, as Joshua is saying, it's used in different ways. Socialism versus capitalism, it's economic systems. But then I'm considered a socialist because I want Medicare for all, just tightening the weave on the social safety net. And, I think that's where the democratic socialist space comes in, where it's not really fighting capitalism as an economic structure, but tightening the weave on the social safety net. And I think I'm a socialist, and I think I'm a libertarian socialist, and I've been told that that's synonymous with a narco-communist. And I'm really excited to learn more about myself in this broadening my understanding of socialism.
Akua, you had something you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, and I'm going to sound a bit inflammatory here. When we talk about what are the next steps to get towards a society that we can consider to be somewhat socialist, if not socialist in nature, I start with encouraging, giving people a place to go so they can stop voting for Democrats. We all understand where the Republican Party, like what their, for lack of a better word, what their philosophy is, and it's pretty clear cut. But what we've been seeing over these last couple of weeks with the protests that we've been having all over the country is that the Democrats aren't up to the moment. And the moment calls for a radical rethinking of how labor with the relationship between labor and capital. And like, even when we think about like George Floyd's life, like the guy was working 3 jobs when he died. Like the Tuesday that when he was memorialized, like he would have been at one of 3 of the jobs that he had. Like, think about that dynamic, right? Think about what the society calls for. And I think Courtney has this right with the list that she just rattled off, where all of these areas of our society are so capitalized, heavily leveraged and capitalized, where we have a scenario where I think it's like 2 in 5 companies that are bought by private equity are more likely to get into 2 times more likely to get into bankruptcy. And when you think about like the lives of the laborers that built that company or those companies, you start to understand the role that the Democratic Party has played with its relationship, because of its relationship to capital and to the donor class in this country, and the role that has played in systematically dismantling unions, unions in this country. Though ironically, the unions of the police officers don't seem to have been affected the same way as general labor unions have in this country, which is strange to me, but it's worth pointing out the power that the police unions have. But the people who turn beef patties down at McDonald's can't even get or even at Amazon can't even get management to let them organize into a union. So you want to know how to get to socialism? Stop voting for Democrats.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. An interesting thing came through my feed today. Facebook is putting out a Slack-like workspace, and and it has built into it the ability to censor words. And the example used was unionize was the word that was used as the example. And I haven't dug into it yet, but it's very, very interesting to me because corporate America is such a bold and insidious thing at the same time. And I think, Akua, you bring up such a great point here. Why are the police unions so vibrant and powerful when all of the other unions in the country, which the union in my mind is kind of the last bastion of socialism, the good part. Capitalism can work if the union is strong. It can do that job. And to go back to something that Joshua said, the worker-owned co-op, the well-organized union, those things are structures that could conceivably make a society like ours work, but they're all failing. For what reason? We seem to be getting an idea of what's really going on behind the scenes. Anyway, I want to give the floor to Joshua because rather than speak, I want to listen to the guests. What's your take on where's the conversation leading your brain, Joshua?
So when I was younger, I didn't consider myself to be political. I did I went to protests and stuff, but I considered myself pretty apolitical when I would have opinions on things. Today, pretty much everything we do, I recognize that everything we do is political. And every part of our society, whether we like it or not, is politicized. And I think the most important part of our society, the place where we spend the most of our labor and most of our time, is completely undemocratic, and that is our workplaces. The fact that we view democracy as such an important part to having a just society, but we don't think that it should apply to our the place where we put all of our labor and our time and energy into. I think that is what leads to a lot of the inequalities that we have. Undemocratic workplaces is what leads to things like if you are a factory in the Rust Belt, a company can just ship your jobs overseas and, just to make a little bit of profit, regardless of what it does to the workers or the community in that area. If you have a democracy in a workplace, and let's say you run a car factory, the workers would never decide to ship their jobs overseas just to save a couple bucks for their bosses. That wouldn't have to happen because you would be making decisions based on what is best for you and your community. This is something that I think appeals to the average worker in America. And the only thing you have to break through is the idea that socialism is some sort of authoritarian ideology. And that is frankly why you don't lead with just calling it socialism. You talk about the ideas behind it. Because that is essentially where we win. It is the ideas. The ideas that we have are popular, they're already good, and they are very clearly beneficial to the average worker in America. And I think that is why we are actually making progress, and particularly with the younger generations, where they have access to information and to videos of people saying things like what I'm saying here today. I think that's why we are actually winning. The younger generations view socialism as very favorable, and it makes them more likely to vote for someone if they are a socialist. Whereas in past generations, it's been, mostly, even with younger generations before the internet, it wasn't very popular and people just generally didn't know what it was. Now, I think that is why we have to continue on this path of, building a socialist movement in America, because if you don't have any ideological framing behind what your plan is, I don't think that it will succeed. I think that as long as we have a general idea of progress, I think that's how we end up with people like Elizabeth Warren being popular, because people don't see the difference between someone who believes that you should control and own your workplace or someone who just thinks that you should have slightly better conditions. I think that, all of our problems in society cannot be addressed without addressing the ownership paradigm. The ownership paradigm is such a big problem in this country, because if your boss owns your workplace, the bank owns your home, and corporations own your politicians, I think that's it's going to be almost impossible to get change in any part of your society, because you'll be fighting against every single part of your society until you have control of at least one segment. And I think the easiest place to take control is actually your workplace, because without you as the worker, nothing gets done. So.
Right. So tell me about the Essential Workers Party. What is this concept?
Well, we're trying to build a party that appeals to the average working class person. And, we tried a lot of different labels and phrases and names to put on a ballot line. And with all of the ones we tried, we saw that it would have been more disadvantageous to just running as a Democrat, despite being a socialist. And with this term, for the first time in American history, there is a term that is associated with, the class identity of being a worker that is naturally popular and that people identify themselves as being part of. If you are an essential worker, you hear the term essential worker and you immediately think of yourself. Before this, people generally didn't identify as workers. Even if they were a worker or a blue collar worker, when you say worker, they don't really think about them. And I think this is a moment in time where we have a chance to actually popularize the notion of class consciousness, of people recognizing that they are part of the working class and that the working class is the most important part of a society that wants to actually function. Without the working class, no wealth is created, no businesses operate, and frankly, there could be no bosses without no workers. But the other way around, you can't have workers that run a place without having shareholders and executives. And we see that very evidently in worker co-ops, where their workplaces are actually run by the workers themselves. So.
Yeah. So go back to Akua. I love this advice of getting away from the corporatist party of the Democrats. What can you draw our attention to the hot races from your vantage point?
Yeah, well, here's the deal. When we started the movement for a national progressive party, that was about around about March when the pandemic hit. And what we're really focused on are the races in 2022 that we're preparing for. But the ones that we're really interested in right now are the Cori Bushes, the Adam Christensen down in Florida, the Jen Perlmans down in Florida, Hillary Turner in West Virginia. And I want people to pay attention. I want people, especially people of color in the South. I want you to pay attention to the struggles that our more white or Caucasian or white brothers and sisters are going through in the Appalachian region, like Kentucky, West Virginia, like that area there. There's a shifting of the tide of the political tides happening there. And, with Bashir being the governor, he just made a controversial move, which I think is controversial, and I'll explain why in a minute, where he's committed to extending Medicare for Black people and only Black people in Kentucky, which I find as very problematic and emblematic of the kind of pandering that the Democratic Party does to specific communities at the expense of others. Like, we didn't ask for Medicare for Black people. We didn't ask for Medicare for Indigenous people. We asked for Medicare for everybody. And by singling out the Black community, especially in a region like Appalachia, where the racial disparities couldn't be clearer, the racial and economic disparities couldn't be clearer, you're setting up essentially a powder keg to explode, a powder keg of racism to explode in Kentucky, and I'm sure he knows it, but his advisors may see it otherwise, right? But in terms of the races that we're excited about, the Appalachian region with Hillary Turner, and down in Florida with Jen Perlman and Adam Christensen.
Yeah. Cool. And I guess, where my mind goes now is actually the topic for next week, and I was actually considering inviting both of you back for next week's show. Next week's show is on this idea of Party X. You know, what would it take to unite the left and actually create a situation where we had, you know, the progressives and the Greens and, you know, whatever essential workers and the socialists, and somehow unite that in order to create a full spectrum force, you know, that had national ballot access, that had major party status, that had, you know, the full spectrum of elected officials that the Vermont Progressive Party has. And just briefly, you know, we're going to be out of time here in a moment, but where is that idea sitting with you guys right now? Joshua, why don't we start with you? I'm just curious as to, in the weeks since I've spoken to you last, where is this idea? How has it evolved in your mind?
Well, I think what it will take to actually unite the left would be actually winning. I think that's frankly what has to happen. You know, if we see someone get elected under the Progressive Party, I think that success can be used to, bring more popular support into it. If we were to see a victory on the national level or on the federal level from a Green, I think that would have resulted in more support within the Green Party, and I think that's just basically what we're looking for. Whatever works, and I think what it takes for that to happen is for regular working class people to identify with something and view it as something that would represent them and something that they would support. And I think we're just waiting to figure out how that happens. There was a time in American history where socialism was popular with the working class, and the idea of socialism was building popularity very quickly. And then the Red Scare stuff happened, and that became a big obstacle for people trying to do socialism. And I think that's what progressivism generally came out of. And for a period of time, the term progressivism was very, very popular, and it's gone up and down. And I don't know, I don't know what is going to happen. I don't know exactly what's going to resonate with the average worker, but I think that's essentially what our goal should be as the left, is figuring out how to appeal to the average worker with socialist or progressive ideas, and getting them to not only support but actively participate and build up a movement that is capable of doing much more than an individual politician. I think we saw the beginnings of that with the Bernie Sanders campaign. The whole concept of not me, us is kind of what has to be true with everything. A party is only as powerful as its members. And a politician is only as powerful as the people supporting him or her. And so I think that's kind of what we, I think that's really what we are just looking for. I don't know what other term to use. It's just, we are, it's all kind of new for all of us. We've never had a single moment in in American history as unusual as this one. We're in a pandemic where we're also, having riots and protests all over the country for social issues, and then we're also having people, standing up and or standing together and not paying their rent, doing rent strikes, and this is, I think it could be an opportunity for us to build a mass movement that is united and actually does challenge the power of the Democratic and Republican Party. This could lead to a reverting in our society. And I think that, we have to make sure that the left is building power, and that we are, building class consciousness. Otherwise, we might see this whole movement die and turn into just another, Occupy Wall Street type thing, where, just the lack of organization and didn't really lead to material success beyond, having strong organizers come out of it. And I think that's what we should be aiming for right now, is just building it to be larger than it is. Right now, the percentage of people who consider themselves socialists or consider themselves to be progressive is pretty small. And I think that we need to just get other people whose ideas already aligned with ours, people who agree with our ideas and our policies. We need to get them to all I guess, become part of the political organizing force that we have in this country, and that's really what it takes. And I think the youth is probably the best place to go for that right now. I think we really missed an opportunity during the Bernie Sanders election. Young people in general already supported him; they already agreed with his ideas, but they weren't really brought into the movement as like organizers the way I think that they were in 2016. I think that there is a large base of left and like radically like revolutionary types that we just really need to get them organized, and that is the Zoomer generation, who is just ready to do more. So
I'd like to just respond to something Joshua had just said. I mean, we can't understate the contribution of Bernie Sanders' campaign to the movement, but we also can't discount the damage that it has done to progressivism. Like, had we known, and by we I mean had progressives known that Bernie Sanders in the middle of a pandemic was going to, he was going to suspend his campaign. Like, had we known that, how many of us would have given those 5, 10, 15, 20 bucks per month to the campaign, had we known that he was going to suspend his campaign? Like, we can't be naive about this. The fact of the matter is, the Democratic establishment co-opted the Sanders campaign, and that hampered the left's response. Like, it hampered our ability to organize around the Greens or the National Progressive Movement, or even the Movement for Our People's Party. Like, it really hampered our attempts to do that, right? Because all of our energies were pushed into the Bernie Sanders campaign. And I will continue to sound the alarm on that, and continue to be critical of the Bernie Sanders campaign for that, because we have to be, when we're talking about a third party, what it would take to build a third party in this country, it has to be a reckoning with the idea that we don't belong in the Democratic Party. They've been telling us this since 2008, and they've been telling us this long before that point. But they really sounded off on it in 2008 to 2016. And we have to, and as leftists, we have to grapple with that and be fine with not running presidents, not running congressional candidates, and focusing on the actual offices that affect our material lives. Like, for instance, the district attorney that decided not to charge Chauvin when he had murdered George Floyd on video. Like, that is an office that you get a direct vote for if you live in Minnesota. Like the Republican governor up in Flint, up in Michigan, who had known that the lead levels, that the levels of lead in the water and in the pipes were unsafe long before they reported it to the CDC or any other federal body, right, to do anything about it. Like, those are offices that actually affect the material well-being of people. Like, the president, God bless his soul, is an important office, but I dare say not as important as who your sheriff is, who decides to prosecute marijuana, who decides whether or not to prosecute your sheriff, and your district attorney, who decides whether or not to prosecute marijuana cases.
Yeah, interestingly enough, in Washington, we don't have any low-level races. Any ground-level races are all odd years for the most part. So this year we'll have county commissioner and up, state reps and congressional seats. So all the focus on the lowest level races actually come a year from now. We actually have a year to prepare for them. Which means
we have to be thinking about them now.
Exactly. And it just, reinforces this whole ground up idea, the idea of moving from the ground up. And meanwhile, we have people like Joshua, who's actually, making a run for a congressional seat and has raised, I mean, what are you, nearly $200,000 into this race now, and making real runs. And we got people who are making serious challenges to very high level seats. One of the highest offices in the land.
Legit.
Yeah. So we're getting low on time here. Courtney, I want to make sure there's space for your voice, though. Do you have anything else you want to add, or if anybody has anything to add, now would be the time to do it. Before we go, I'll give you both another chance to pitch who you are and where you come from and your website and stuff like that. But Courtney, I just wanted to make a little bit of space just in case you've got anything you wanted to bring up.
Well, this is all really brought together a lot of the things that have been on my mind lately. I was someone who on my 18th birthday cried with joy that I could finally vote. I have been interested in electoral work for a long time in my heart, but in my early 20s took at least a decade off from being really involved in it because I just found it to be so disheartening and dirty, and realizing that you don't have to really be into electoral work to get things done. But Bernie Sanders brought me back into it because he created space. He held space for progressive ideals, for political action that didn't have to be slimy, with the anti-corruption part of his movement. And when COVID hit and his campaign for this election was disbanded, all the plans in the electoral space that had been made about how to push the DNC and what we were going to do at convention and all these potential possibilities were eradicated because we couldn't gather in groups. And instantly, my mind went to labor. Labor is where the power lies at this point. And I think the current situation, the magnification and amplification of Black Lives Matter and the greater movement with this recent killing of George Floyd has sparked a segment of the population in a way that I think can help push, be a catalyst for all of us. It's magnifying one area of trouble where there are many, and we should take all the fires that are burning to motivate ourselves as a working class to make these changes, because as was pointed out, most of us aren't going to be voting on city council races for at least a year, and we need to have changes made now. And we can, if we can rally the working class, we can have those changes made far sooner than if we were working through the electoral process, which had become disheartening in and of itself because we are looking at 10 years to a climate disaster. And if we don't have things in place in the next 2 years, that 10-year time frame won't be met. So it really is a working class movement right now, and we need to be rising to the streets with our masks on and making sure that the people who are currently in office are responding to us.
Yeah, agreed. So yeah, before we wrap up, Akua or Joshua, do either of you want to add anything, any closing thoughts before we do websites and 1 minute pitches for what we're doing?
Yeah, I'd love for Joshua to go first, and then I'll respond.
Yeah. So I just, I mean, like they were both saying, I mean, the impact of Bernie's presidential campaign, there's a lot of positive and there is also some negative. And I think, a lot of us are really disappointed with, the decision to drop out and, suspend his campaign or whatever around the time that he did. I think that, what this did do, though, is it really hurt the ability to organize behind electoral politics. I think a lot of young people in particular, this was a souring experience for them. And I think, that is why workplace organizing does need to happen. But I think when it comes to the different ways that we organize. I think it's a kind of a fight on all fronts type of thing. When they had a revolution in Russia or in other countries, usually it's not just one person fighting for this electoral thing. It's a fight on all fronts. They're organizing the workplaces. They're organizing community mutual aid. They're doing everything, and that's kind of the common theme you see behind successful left movements around the world is the people who disagree on tactics are still uniting behind the same movements. Even if you are someone who believes in maybe focusing on lower level electoral politics or higher level electoral politics or non-electoral and such as workplace organizing, it's important that those are all united into one movement rather than being separated off and kind of treating them as if we're people who disagree on the end goal, because I think that is the one important thing about all of us is we do all agree that we need to actually achieve a society that does provide healthcare for everyone, where workers do have the power and aren't people who are just constantly oppressed from every facet of our society. And I think that's what we're doing here today, and I think that's kind of where this whole movement in general needs to move right now. I think, becoming united between the DSA, the Green Party, the Progressive Party, as long as we don't view each other as competition rather than, just separate arms of the same movement. I think that's, how we have to view it.
Akua?
And I mean, I think Joshua's right about how we view each other as movements on the left. But I'm always going to be pushing sounding the trumpet on local politics, and I think no more struggles than desegregation best exemplifies how you get eventual change. When desegregation, when Iowa, which was one of the first states to desegregate in 1868, desegregate public schools in 1868 started, it was still federally not a policy for states to desegregate schools, right? And I think it's the same way that we have to tackle a lot of the local problems that we have around unions and around things like starting to break down the Taft-Hartley Act and other such problematic laws that are on the books, where we can take a picture from desegregation and the way how states have applied marijuana laws in order to effect change at the local level. So yeah, we definitely aren't competition, but the philosophy that we have around how we can move forward is different. And we have to be able to come to grips with that if we're going to unite and fight. Because, one person can only give so many donations to so many movements per month. So we have to figure out a way to roll all of these efforts into one.
Yeah, I hear that. Okay, we better wrap up. I just want to give you guys one more chance. I know you'll be repeating yourselves a little bit, but Joshua first, then Akua, just give us your name, your website, what you're running for, just to give the people who are watching one more shot at how to reach you and stuff like that. And then Courtney, if you could take us home after that, that'd be great. Go ahead, Joshua. Yeah,
I'm Joshua Collins. I am at Joshua for Congress, the number 4, Joshua for Congress, on every platform, including TikTok. My website's joshua2020.com. You can sign up to volunteer, join our Discord server, donate, anything like that, at joshua2020.com.
Thanks for being here. Go ahead, Akua.
Yeah, and I'm Akua Walters, and my Twitter is at Walters Akua. So it's my name backwards, at Walters Akua on Twitter. The National Progressive Party's website is www.nationalprogressiveparty.org. And you can go there, sign up to be on the organizing team, the outreach team, which I run. Like we said, like we're very focused on 2022, 2023, 2024. Those are the next sets of election years that we're looking at. We're interested in running what we like to call coalition campaigns, where we use one office, one donate button for every district. So if you're considering running as a mayor in a particular district, you and every mayoral candidate in that district, you all share one office. Same for comptroller. All of those resources will be rolled into one, along the lines of what I've described here earlier. We're looking forward to hearing from everybody who listens to this program, and I think that to Joshua's point, we definitely are looking forward to him winning in a couple of months.
Word. Courtney, you want to take us home?
Yes. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us on Progressive Washington, the media arm of the Washington Progressive Party. We will be having these shows weekly. Join us again. You can find ways to reach us in the discussion box below the YouTube video here. Be sure to donate to Uphill Media to keep our lights on. We were previously Bernie TV 2016. And a shout out to John Ellis, our originator. And thank you so much again for joining us, our guests, Akua Walters and Joshua Collins, and Tyler Vega for your remarkable co-hosting abilities. Thank you and have a lovely day.